Where to begin? We could go a number of places tonight. We started into the actual text last week a little bit, and maybe come back to that. But before that, I just want to say a few other things. First of all, did anybody have any questions of anything that was previously? I mean, questions that I could actually address or try to answer. Going once, going twice. You got a question? Oh, okay. Maybe just a little bit back on the history for those of you who might be interested in this. As we said, there were variations of this text that came from Central Asia, compiled at different times, and you might think this is unique or special to this particular text, the Avatamsaka Sutra. But the texts within the Buddhist tradition all more or less come from a common trajectory. So at the time when a Buddha or the Buddha's teaching, let's say this happens to be in the Indian subcontinent, he doesn't write anything down. You all know this. So there's nothing written. These are more or less spontaneous exchanges between student and teacher, between ordinary people, kings, other enlightened beings and whatnot, in a trajectory of said to be 49 years of his teaching span. After the Buddha passes, an attempt is made then to try to codify some of these teachings and organize them. And it was a task fraught with difficulty. And so, regardless of what school or tradition you come out of, all these traditions have a common challenge, which is because nothing was written down, whatever the Buddha said, might have said, taught, did not teach, what he meant with what he said, which is even a more difficult question. Because he himself said he uses words and languages expediently to untie knots and attachments, and once the knot and attachment's untied, don't attach to the language or the text or the teaching that was used for that. So that orientation in teaching is very different than just getting the word down, because the word carries a whole different meaning here. There's many words. And sometimes there's no words. Sometimes the Buddha answered a difficulty or question with silence, and that opened up something for somebody. Where is that teaching? It can't be sort of passed along. You all know this. I'm not saying something that's new to you, but it's really important to understand that. So therefore, whatever was passed along was the recollections, the remembrances of the disciples that were with him for various periods of time during his teaching career. Some for most of it, some for part of it. And as we also know, some heard and saw different things in the same places and different places at the same time in different times. And it seemingly the Buddha said one thing in one place and taught another thing in another place. So which one was it? And there is no it here in that sense of a dogmatic, doctrinal canon. It's rather something that's fluid and dynamic. We call it an open canon rather than a closed canon. So that being said, it's really, I didn't want to single out the Avatamsaka and say, well, because there was 40 rolls, 60 rolls, 80 rolls, and they came at different times, there's just a lot of uncertainty about the authenticity of this. But if we remember that whatever, and again I put in quotation marks, original teachings, whether there were such things as the original teachings is really a question. Anyhow, whatever was heard was then recorded from ear to hand and written down, but none of this gets written down until 300 to 400 years after the Buddha's passing. So the earliest written records we have is somewhere between the end of the first century of I guess people date it from the time of Christ. I'm not going to do that. So BCE and CE, where you go from 100 BCE to 100 CE. It used to be BC and AD for you, through those who are in the old school. That's when all of this starts. So within 150, 200 years, almost everything that we have begins to get written down then. And then, of course, there's later writings. So all of this is passed along orally up till that time. Now, you got to imagine, I mean, in fairness, that what undoubtedly was passed along was subject to both oral and scribal error, or different interpretations. Just as with tonight, maybe some of you just remember 4% of what I just said, some of you remember 50%, some of you haven't even tuned in here, you're still in your cell phones. You know, it's sort of like, what is it that's being said and heard? And even if you were to write it down, there can be errors. And then it's passed along from disciple to disciple over time, and over country and over culture and over languages. And so it gets reorganized, probably adjusted, it gets clarified, sometimes expanded, sometimes contracted from compiler to compiler. This is not a problem with this tradition. In other traditions where this becomes a big issue, what was the actual word? This is not a problem in this tradition because the way the teachings were set up were never meant to be set up as a closed doctrinal canon per se, but rather as a series of expedient devices used to untie people's attachments and grasping and confusion, so that once untied, the inherent wisdom would open by itself, and it wasn't given from without. So that's why if you understand the teachings in that way, this doesn't become a particular challenge with the Avatamsaka. I don't know if I'm rehashing something you already know, but it's important to understand that, because somebody will say, well, look, in this particular text, and you're going to see what you go into, it's not just the Buddha who is supposed to be speaking here. Sometimes Bodhisattva speaks, sometimes Devas speak, sometimes ordinary people are speaking, and they are actually lecturing or giving the text, giving the teaching. How can that be? Because supposedly, this is supposed to be the word of the Buddha, right? So again, the expression for that is called Buddha Vachana, word of, now here's how you get it tricky, word of the Buddha or word of a Buddha? Okay, generally it's put in small letters, Buddha Vachana, one word, meaning that the word or the teaching or the sound of an enlightened one. And that's the expression. So what you have here then is a question right from this tradition itself, that authorship to Shakyamuni Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, is not necessarily the measure of authority and authenticity in and of itself. Even if you could establish that, which is almost impossible to do because he didn't write anything down. And of course there were no quote recordings. So then people are feeling a little nervous, but then what do we have to rely on? But the teaching itself all addresses most of these questions. So that being said, it's really important to know that these texts, whether we're coming out of any tradition or school of thought that you associate with Buddhism, never say or limit the teaching to what was spoken or given by the historical Buddha. Should I say that again? It is authorship and authority and authenticity is not limited to the historical Buddha. That's really important. And then you have, sometimes it's his disciples that speak. Ananda, Shariputra, Manjushri as a bodhisattva disciple, Mahakashapa, the disciples who were around at the time. Also, how about their disciples? And their disciples, and their disciples. All are capable of carrying on Buddha Vachana, the word of the Buddha. In some cases, the devas or the gods are transmitting Buddha Vachana. So basically, the texts ring with authenticity, not just because they can be attributed to one person, which is very, very difficult to do, but because they have something else that makes them authentic. So what would that be? I'm just sort of throwing that out now. How else would you then measure that? And by the way, there is in the 12 divisions of the teachings, one, and I'll read it to you if I can find it here. It's really interesting. In other words, after the teachings came, they were divided into 12 categories of types. Prose lines, repetitions, predictions, interjections, spoken without request, like the Avamtasaka Sutra. No one requested that. The last section of the Shurangama Sutra wasn't spoken request. The Buddha just gave it because nobody knew to ask for it. And so, but there's one particular division that is, it's never been spoken before. Let me see if I can actually quote the passage for you, because I think you'll find it kind of interesting. This is the thing about computers. Once you put it there, it gets lost often. But let me just suffice to say there is a category that never been spoken before. And so what this means is there is still an evolving canon. There's still teachings coming that could come in 2019, 2021, and into the future. And then the criteria for whether these are Buddha Vachana has to do more with other ways of measuring. So what would anybody want to give a guess at what the criteria would be then?
If it has an effect on you personally?
Say that again.
If it has an effect on you personally?
If it has an effect on you personally. And that would be what kind of effect?
Transformational?
Explanation?
Awakening?
What's that?
Awakening?
Awakening. Okay. All of these beg further questions, but we're onto something in the sense that, and you know you're awakened because, but it could be some personal, you're saying some personal existential connection, resonance, and then possibly an awakening type of experience that happens as a result of hearing it.
I was reminded of what you were saying earlier about how this text and the platform sutra had a personal, you had a personal connection with it.
Mm-hmm.
And that they moved you, but you were also aware that with some people that was not the case. So.
That's right. For some people, they'll hear the text and there's nothing. Sometimes there's an aversive reaction, and sometimes there's a very positive reaction. So then, what would criteria be?
4 out of 5 bodhisattvas recommend.
Well, that's a very interesting 4 to 5 bodhisattvas recommended. You're not off in a sense that this is close to one of the things that happened. Basically, it's been used and attested to and guided generations of scholar practitioners. It's part of the inspired tradition. So you get the received tradition, which is the text, but the inspired tradition continues to liberate, to untie, to open up, to develop our compassion and our kindness and so on and so forth, and our wisdom. And so because they are orthopraxic, they work in the actual practice of it, the authenticity of that is the proof is in the pudding, so to speak, to use an English expression. But it's not just your personal experience. You're looking at what is the inspired tradition coming from teacher to teacher, from community to community over time. You look at commentaries, you look at does it accord and have something that touches with other texts? Is there an integrity to it? Is there sort of a color to it that goes across all? And a consistency, even in the apparent inconsistencies. In other words, the Buddha teaches compassion to one, teaches vinaya to another. These are not contradictory teachings, just different skill and means for that particular time. But overall, does it tend towards liberated wisdom? That's one. So 4 out of 5. I would say probably 5 out of 5 would be better. Anything else? Anybody else remembers or?
We have a comment from online.
Okay.
If it reduces suffering and increases global compassion from self to universality.
So what's interesting, what I'm hearing from you and online, or your interpretation of what's online, is not necessarily going to a person and saying because this person said, then it has authenticity and authority. But you're going to, I wouldn't say these are subjective, but more qualitative measures of something. And I think probably this is well supported in the texts themselves. By the way, this particular question that we're raising is not a postmodern question. It's actually a question the Buddha himself addressed and considered and was asked. So let me just give you one passage and we'll move out of this. But sometimes I bring these things up because it's easy to get the misimpression that when we study a text like this and when it has a number of sources and a number of recensions and so on and so forth, people think, oh, well, this has got a particular problem. Just give me the word of the Buddha. That's all I want. And that is not as simple as it seems. And it's not as simple as it seems not because the Buddha didn't know how to write or wasn't capable of communicating, but because the nature of the teaching was actually counterproductive to writing it down. So as soon as you wrote it down, it locked it into a formula. It locked it into a teaching. And then it could or could not be applied expediently. In other words, medicine has to be prepared in response to the condition that comes up. You can't just have medicine and just pass it on because someone is, quote, sick. So by writing it down, you solidify it into something that loses its spontaneity and responsiveness. And in fact, when the Buddha actually finished his teaching, he said, I didn't teach anything. So this is his actual words. In other words, what he's saying, the teaching is only there because of the difficulty. Once the difficulty is over, there is no teaching. There is no dharma per se outside of the needs and the conditions of living beings and their confusion. If that weren't there, there wouldn't be any. So this really is very different than an orthodoxic tradition. But this question came up, and I'll just pass this on to you, and then because it supports it. Basically, and this is from a text, from a Nikaya text, and also from something called the Kulavagga. And the Buddha essentially in this exchange said, whatever is conducive to liberation and not bondage, that is my teaching. That's Buddha Vachana. And this came up because the Buddha's foster mother. Anybody know who the Buddha's foster mother was? This wasn't Health, Human, Services. You know, his mother passed away. Right, the Buddha's mother passed away early on. And so his foster mother, come on.
His
who?
mom's sister, I
Mahapashapati?
think. And
Mahapashapati? That was her name. Oh, okay. She was the one that really pushed the Buddha to accept women into the Sangha and begin the woman's order, and the Buddha consented. And then she later, very directly, essentially goes up to the Buddha and says, "Give it to me in a nutshell." So, I mean, what she's saying is, there's going to be a lot of people talking and teaching. I was your foster mother. I don't really want to beat around the bush here very much. So just tell me, what's the Buddha Vachana in a nutshell? And what's the Dharma? And here's the Buddha's answer. Whatever teachings, and the name that she has here is Gautami, Gautami Mahapashapati. Whatever teachings, O Gautami, you can assure yourself, these teaching leads to dispassion, not to passion. So he says, what are the teaching? What's Dharma? Whatever leads to dispassion and not to passion, to freedom from bondage and not bondage, to decrease in possessions and craving and coveting, not to increase, to fewness of desires, not to many desires, to contentment, not to discontentment, to solitude, not to solitude. By solitude, he means not so much that you live alone, but that you're in a sort of self-present, self-composed, not needy and clingy. But solitude doesn't necessarily mean that you're in the woods solitude. It means that you have a wholeness about you that doesn't need to be constantly reinforced. You're not in a sticky mode. Not to over-socializing. To exertion, to effort, rather than to indolence or laziness. To ease in maintaining and training on yourself, not to difficulty. Indeed, you may consider this is the Dharma, this is the Vinaya, this is the teaching of the teacher. So, in this text and others, you get what makes it authentic or real is the therapeutic, liberating effect it has on the individual. It's a very sense, in modern life, it's kind of pragmatic in the sense that it produces these results, and by these results we know it's... Now, of course, this opens up, and I'm not going to go into it, a whole can of worms about how you would know that this is liberating and this is what. But the presumption is that you have the wherewithal to know. And part of the reason why you would then meditate or sit calmly and listen and consider and feel what's going on with your body, with your emotions and so forth, is to take stock of how this is playing out. Are you agitated or are you getting calm? Are you craving this and that, or are you finding enough and knowing when to stop? Are you too out there, or are you kind of centered? And even though you're with people, you're not losing yourself amongst the crowd and so forth. You're going through these reflections. Meditation at one stage is nothing more than that reflective feedback mechanism that you have to listen to yourself. And then that helps you tune and figure out, is this Dharma, is this not Dharma? Where am I, and of course the standard ones you always use are your klesha going down, the afflictions. Sometimes called the defilements, sometimes called the flames, greed, anger, stupidity, jealousy, envy, torpor. A few more? What are some of the others? Nihilism. Are these things being reduced? Are they getting less? If they're getting less, then whatever you're doing is the teaching and so forth. So this is a qualitative measuring thing, and eventually, by following this, and you see now why this is such a mature kind of teaching, because it's not simply saying the Buddha said. You have to listen to yourself and exactly reflect and be really honest. It's kind of a bittersweet honest. Is this really working to make me a better person, to perfect my humanity, to get rid of the edges and the barbs and so forth? I don't know, we can go into this, but it's not just modern psychobabble we're talking about here. It's a very deep sense of liberation, to the point that even when facing your own mortality and death, there's still equanimity. You've gotten to the point where you can go into that with a level and even disposition of mind. So this is a very profound thing, but what I'm trying to point to is that it's not a teaching that's out there, but it's a reflection on whether or not it's leading to this, what he says, the unbinding. Let the mind be unattached, clinging to nothing, as the sixth patriarch says. This is where this one's kind of going. So, any more on that? Questions about that? I'm sorry I kind of rushed through it and maybe overstated it or overgeneralized, but I wanted to give a flavor for it, that when you're reading the Avatamsaka Sutra then, the question that's you're posing as you go through is, where is this feeding into and addressing my binding, my hang-ups, my attachments? What light is it giving to me to break free of this, to see myself in different ways? And this can happen in 1,000 different ways with a text that's so huge and so multifaceted. But always that existential question, and it's not a selfish, oh, it's all about me kind of thing. That's not what I'm going. It is all about you. It should be all about you or me. But not in the selfish sense of getting, but in the sort of larger sense of getting free. So that becoming the best person you can be, you actually have some contribution then for others. Go ahead.
What are the boundaries of this canon? I'm curious how they relate to other texts from other traditions. I think you've said that the gazillion Dharma doors can include being a follower of another faith tradition. But obviously those texts have a different purpose and are meant to be, say, the word of God or whatever.
Yeah, I don't know in the presentation of what he just gave to Gautami, this was very when you go through this and when she realizes these things, there's an actually unbound, liberated state that results at the end where there's no attachment or binding even to other, to a divine or to something outside. So again, that would be one of the markers that even though these texts can be used along a trajectory of liberation, ultimately this teaching deconstructs itself totally. So at the end, you're not even relying on the text, nor are you relying on a God or a Buddha or a Bodhisattva or any. That's the goal, to actually replicate the awakening experience of a Buddha. And a Buddha, upon awakening, has no attachments, no binding, none of that exists anymore. So in that sense, while all teachings can be to some degree expedient, as you move further and further along, you're moving into a range of teachings or a goal that leaves all teachings behind. And that isn't to abandon your ground, but it's actually to be so whole and complete that you don't need anything anymore. It's returning to your original nature. That's a very different proposition than a lot of, say, other teachings, even though they can be used expediently to precept you, to get you to think about other people, not be so selfish. But ultimately, this liberation is beyond, I think, even itself. That's what it's posing. It's not saying, oh, it's beyond this teaching and that teaching. It says it's even beyond this itself. That's why the Buddha's parable of the raft. Once you cross over to the other shore, you don't need the raft anymore. That letting go of the teaching itself is a very different, yeah. Anything else? Questions, comments? Yeah.
I was remembering a question I had at the end of last session. And it relates to how you distinguish between sort of something useful in a text and exoticism.
Exoticism.
Exoticism, yeah, what's culturally exotic to you, and therefore may seem more profound or insightful than it actually is, or it's profound in a way that you do not perceive because it seems exotic to you.
It's being
Seems exotic to you. And I was reminded of, I had a friend in the 80s who went to study abroad in Taiwan for a year, and he came back and had a t-shirt that he bought over there that had a picture of a pole vaulter on it, and it said in English something that was essentially meaningless in English. It was like run, fun, jump, throw, or something like that. You know, it was just sort of meaningless, essentially meaningless English words strung together. And I asked him, I said, what is that? Why would they do that? You know, why would they put these basically meaningless words on it? And he said, they think it's exotic. You know, they think that it's English words are exotic to them.
Mm-hmm.
And that was eye-opening for me at the moment, because it was like, oh, they think we're exotic, you know? And so something that is essentially meaningless to us seemed, I guess, profound, or something interesting, at least, to them. How do you, as a Westerner, look at these texts and not get sort of bedazzled by the exoticism?
Yeah, many layers of questions there. What I said earlier was the therapeutic way you approach the text, if you're a serious, mature person, is to ask really fundamental, basic questions of life, death, meaning, purpose. I'm assuming that for most people, but maybe not everybody, exoticism is now understood to be how shall I say, overrated. Those of you who are coming out of Berkeley, I know there's many exotic things that you can dive into here, but after a certain time, and you see this with the biographies of many great cultivators, including the Buddha himself, the appeal of the exotic, although at the beginning stimulating and fun, quickly empties and tires. This is Byron's poem on Don Juan, has to do with somebody who's at 25 and basically burned through all that's exotic. And in a sense, we have now more opportunity to see through the exotic than we have in the past. Especially we have liberty and leisure. We can indulge our exotic fantasies to the 10th degree. And unless I miss something, which I don't think I miss too much, they don't go anywhere. There's a titillation for a while, and then there's after pleasure comes a sort of drop, a sadness, an emptiness. And you can up the ante a little bit, but it's still the same cycle. In psychology, they call this hedonic adaptation, that you acclimate to the high, and then quickly it becomes a flat and a low, and then you have to move on to something hedonistically more da-da-da. And it doesn't take too long to try to, to figure out, wait a minute, I'm like this bee bouncing off the glass here. I'm just, I'm hitting the glass, I'm not getting through. And as you get older, the exotic starts to actually get a little stale. And also you start to run out of things. And then it can be self-destructive exoticism. The next rush, the next high, the next designer drug, or whatever it is. But there's a point in your learning, in your maturing, where you realize, I think, as a person, not even as a sage, that this is not leading to anything. And so the lure of the exotic drops, and the Buddha in their text call this a sort of, they actually use the word a sort of loss of infatuation that occurs towards material exoticism, a kind of distaste almost, not despondency, but just a sort of feeling like this. And this it's not quite nausea, that's a little strong, but the texts talk about this as the first stage to liberation, is the disenchantment, the loss of infatuation with this as being the first step towards getting free. But it has to come through your own experience. It can't be forced on you. It's something you have to experience directly. So then the next stage is, if you can do this, this is also has to do with exoticism, or seeking the exotic is just another way of indulging desires. So in this text I was reading you, it says to contentment, not constant itching, to fewness of desires rather than increasing those. So you start to realize there's a point, a balance point in my development where, hey, it's okay. I'm centered. This is cool. I don't have too much. I don't have too little. And as you start to mature intellectually, psychologically, you're able to find that place again and again and again. Food, clothing, sleep, sex, everything just sort of starts to reach this point of optimum equilibrium. This is part of the growing process. And again, meditation can help with this. It helps to bring that adjustment back to center, to reset you. So I think if that becomes and that has to be the orientation to cultivate. Because if you're not clear about this, if you're still infatuated and drunk with this sort of thing, you're not ready to actually cultivate in this way because it doesn't have any flavor for you.
Right.
So the flavor of that has to sort of by itself die out before the flavor of this. And the flavor of this, both by the teachings and my own experience, is so satisfying, so enriching, that once you get a flavor of that, you're never by any other exotic flavor ever titillated or satisfied again. It's really funny. You go, I've been cheated. That doesn't taste as good anymore, and this really does. And there's many texts that talk about this, including non-Buddhist texts. I mean, the Taoist texts talk about this all the time. Everybody's out having a good time. I'm just like wasting around, doing nothing. I don't amount to anything. Everybody can be put to some use. I'm useless. They're all bright and shiny. I alone am dull and dark, blah, blah, blah. But he says, but alas, I'm really happy because I only take milk that comes from the mother's breast, meaning the Tao. And everybody else is going through this up and down carnival ride. And so whether you see it, you can see it in American poetry too. This constant, you can see it in Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, these writings of a kind of emptying out of the promise, the allure of the exotic, the erotic, and so on and so forth.
Through repetition in part?
I think it's possibly repetition, but burning out from the Buddhist point of view, it's outflowing. And so in a sense, what you think you're getting, you're actually losing your essential energy in doing this. That's why shopping tires you out. It's called dust fatigue. And so what actually happens is, it's its own feedback mechanism. You know what I'm saying? No, I shall renounce. It's just sort of like, I'm bleeding, I'm tired, what did I just do? I just watched television for 10 hours, and then I went shopping, and then I'm really exhausted. And then I went to this funny retreat, and they're all walking around, and I felt pretty good. I felt energized. What's going on here? Well, it's just the difference of non-outflowing. So they actually have, and this chapter, interestingly, if I ever get into it, one of the first things that comes up is the outflow issue. And it's really interesting because I would say this is not religious. It is psychologically, emotionally palpable to us. Take a measure, an inventory. When do you feel whole, complete, happy, and charged? And when do you feel unhappy, incomplete, and drained? And just do a sort of causal relationship, and you're going to go, duh. The things that I'm chasing after that I think are going to give me are actually robbing me of that essential energy that, that's interesting, that's an interesting. And as a result of this, when you start doing this, your friendships and your social life starts to change. Not because it's a should or should not, just because it's not feeding, it's not satisfying. It's a should that you do. I should go to that party, I should talk to everybody, but what? Well, actually just hanging out in the woods or sitting meditation or, reading a book or something, I get more out of that. That's what's called quietism. And this isn't unique to Buddhism. This is, where do you go to recharge? To the mall? Maybe. Anyhow, yes.
Something about exotic things. When we find something exotic, I think it almost always has an aspect of misunderstanding
Mhm.
or not understanding fully. So we can see this very often, you know, in the 60s, Indian gurus, a lot of Western people followed, it turned out to be kind of a fake person, and then that has to do with exoticism. Exotic, somebody thought it's exotic or it's very wonderful, rare, and then because of this sort of culturally dependent way, one sometimes fails to see the essence, maybe. So that's what I thought when you mentioned exotic.
I was thinking, as you were saying, that exotic appreciation is more about you're projecting yourself onto something else rather than actually taking something in.
In fact, that's what for example, this text about the light, which, again, we won't get into tonight, but the releasing of the light has to do with two mentions. One, the Buddha is releasing light that illuminates things for people. But also these people are cultivating, returning their own light, and they're illuminating. And the combination of that Buddha's light and their own then takes away the exotic. It breaks down the appearance of things, and you start to see what's really true and vibrant, as opposed to the cosmetic circus advertising projection that we're doing. So in a sense, when you say contemplate all things like dreams, illusions, bubble, shadows as impermanent and so on and so forth, that is your light of true seeing that's cutting through the exotic, because behind the exotic is just another Dharma. It's just ordinary. And it seems exotic because it's new or it's freshly minted or something. There's nothing new under the sun. But we constantly do this, and it's feeding a kind of self-deception, the wanting to have something easy and quick and exciting, when in fact we know time after time after time, the exotic very soon becomes the quotidian and the mundane. And it's not what it was expected to be. You know, I could do a lot of things on this. It has to do with, you know, material things, relationships, you know, and so on and so forth. This constant, it comes down to its level equal stature. So yeah, but what's happening here in this particular chapter with the light being released is that people are able, the beings that respond to this are able to use that light to illuminate the nature of things and even see through it further than they already have. So this light is really key to, okay, wow. Where to go? We're done.
Maybe some light.
Well, I'm sorry I digressed so much, but I hope it was next week.
Do you have enough? Do you have a little time to talk about outflows? Is that too big a topic?
It's going to come up. Those of you who have, let me just shoot ahead here, see if I can pull up my text. And we didn't even project the text up. If we go ahead, put my glasses on. So next week, I'm going to really get into this text. Okay, so next week there's two things I want to talk about. One, I want to talk about the light that's being used here and give some examples of that, and get it out of the exotic and the bewildering. And then I want to talk about the worlds that are being talked about here. And I just sent Locke a PDF that basically does a mapping of the 31 realms of existence, the various realms of existence that are being described in this here. And then, here we go. We go down to the text, and we have the questions. Okay, so we go, and we'll read all this, the various bodhisattvas, and then I think it's who is speaking, Manjushri? Manjushri Bodhisattva says, and he begins, if someone sees the one of proper enlightenment as liberated and free from all outflows, this is the first line, and is not being attached to all worlds, ready for the surprise? That person still not as certified to the eye that sees. So wait a minute, that should be good. The next line says, if someone knows that thus come ones, bodies and marks do not exist. Am I reading it correctly? Yeah. And cultivates and attains this understanding, this is emptiness, then that person will quickly become a Buddha. So, obviously outflows have to do with attaching to externals, that's one thing. And the next thing has to do with if you're looking for it in the exotic. How many people come to retreats and whatnot, like, where is it? Where is Kuan Yin? Where's the lotus? A leak in the roof? Oh, sweet dew. This looking for exotic, extraordinary, even world transcending states, the text is telling you is an outflow. And you won't get awakened. Now, it's not saying a Mercedes-Benz or a concubine or blah, blah, blah. How much more so, even if you're looking for Dharma that has this exotic, mark and appearance to it, you won't get it. You're not seeing the thus come one. So this is a very interesting, you asked the question, and we can go into this next week. I will share with you. And what I'm going to do periodically is bring in some of my teachers' commentary as well to help bring this to the here and now, because the way he always taught us, we would go through this and we get this really far out kind of description, and then he would bring it right back to the human, the psychological, the emotional, the existential of our own conditions. And so that's what I'm going to try to do as we go through this. Some of this will be my own, some of it will be borrowed from him, but it will be an attempt to move it from the extraordinary to the ordinary, from the Buddha to the living being, us. And in fact, from this point of view of this text, there's not a difference of degree of kind, it's a difference of degree between a Buddha and a living being, not a difference in kind. So, and I said the other thing is just pretend you're eavesdropping on a pretty rarefied conversation when we don't actually connect it, and then it'll be okay. And then next week I'll tell a story about light too, because I want you to appreciate, and I will throw this out, it is metaphorical. And the release of light from the bottom of the feet, what did you call it, Alona?
Holy roller skates, I think.
Yeah, like holy roller skates or something. From the wheels on the bottom of the feet, like that is both symbolic and metaphorical, and we can discuss it. But I want you to consider that it's also real. And so I will tell a story next week of my experience with this, not just metaphorically, but as real. And I will suggest to you that light can be emitted in this fashion, not only from the feet or the hands or between the eyes of a Buddha, but from other beings as well, and from sutras themselves, and from icons, and so forth, and even aspects of the natural world. And there's a passage in the Earth Store Sutra where it says Buddhas and Bodhisattvas can appear as incredibly beautiful, awe-inspiring aspects of nature, a meadow, a pool, a tall mountain, to cause people to let the light enter and release from them and resolve on Bodhi. So the emission of light takes on a whole different dimension here, just symbolic and metaphorical. It goes into something that's actually very real, and depending on your sensitivity that you are feeling or not feeling at different times, or you're responding to or not responding to. And so we'll go into this next week. I promise. Enough of the preliminaries. Okay, anything else? Nothing? Going once? Going twice? Okay. Announcements? But in preparation, would it be good that those of you can look at this down the line, just read into the beginning of Manjushri's asking the questions. So read past the preliminary, and we'll go into that, but then we'll get right into Manjushri's questions. And the question is, why is Manjushri asking questions? I thought he was the great Bodhisattva of wisdom.
So I have a few announcements. So tomorrow, as you probably know, Monk Heng Sure will continue his lecture also on the Avatamsaka Sutra, a different part of the text. We are entering the 10 grounds, I think, right, in the text.
Yeah,
10 stages.
Last stage.
Or 9 bhumis, right? 10 bhumis in Sanskrit. And also I want to mention that it will be special day in our university, Dharma Rinpoche's university. It will be open house on October 23rd. You can, from 5 p.m. to 7:30, you can come and join the class seminar. You can meet the current students and meet people over there. You can feel the chemistry of the place, and maybe you can consider...
Bathe in the light?
Yeah, you can see the light. You can activate your light, inner light. If you want to become a student, you can consider this. So if you have any question about this, so please, after our lecture, you can ask. And highly recommend it, because it's quite interesting place to be. And I see some faces who are current are students and are graduates, and also can share with you many inspiring stories how to be in this university.
Okay. That's good. I hadn't thought of. My first reaction was, oh, we can't do the transference now because there's that noise. But then my second thought was, when we bow, we're bowing to a screen.
Right.
So it's better to lift it.
Respect to the triple jewel.